Our assigned places. Well, hello everyone. I'm Tom Gjelten from NPR, and let me say first of all that on behalf of NPR and our president Gary Nell, can I say what a pleasure it is to be able to join with Jane and the Wilson Center in producing this national conversation. It's a challenging task these days to promote nonpartisan discussion of significant policy problems, but I think one of the good news from Marshall's presentation of this data is that at least in the area of foreign and security policy, the partisan divide is narrower than it is on other issues. Can I say also it's a great pleasure to be in the company of Jane and General Hayden and Philip Mudd and James Zogby, all of them dedicated public servants who have shown a real commitment to safeguarding our national security over the course of their professional careers. So Marshall, a very interesting presentation of the data, but as we were saying before we came in, just the fact that Americans think certain things about the world doesn't necessarily make it so. And I actually wanted to begin with that point today. We have seen, for example, some of the highlights that I have pulled out from Marshall's presentation is that Americans think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were unsuccessful, did not make the U.S. safer, worsened relations between the United States and the Muslim world. There's also this diminished belief in the dangerousness of the world. I think we can say that seem to be less concerned that unfriendly countries becoming nuclear powers will be a critical threat to U.S. interests. Diminished concern about terrorism, radical Islam, China. So I wanted to begin actually with that point and begin with you, General Hayden. We have an overall sense here, apparently, in the American population that the world is not as dangerous a place as it was before. Is that a realistic sense, or is this perhaps a sign of some complacency on the part of the American population?
There's a bit of truth, I think, to the judgment. But again, as an intelligence officer, always looking at the world through pessimistic lens. Mm-hmm. I would add that the world would be more chaotic. And although the dangers that threaten us may be less catastrophic than we viewed them 10 or particularly 30 years ago, there are more of them, they are less controlled, and they are less in the sweet spot of nation states and traditional security organizations to deal with. I mean, what struck me most of all in the survey was that, for the most part, all the pieces on the board that folks were being asked about were nation states. Mm-hmm. And right now, the real dangers in the world are from subnational actors. And terrorism is an expression of it. Cyber threats are an expression of it. Transnational crimes, an expression of it. None of them existential, certainly for us. And so, again, I think there's broad wisdom in the judgment, but there are real dangers that have to be tended to.
And Philip Mudd, another of the findings that jumped out at me is that people, on the one hand, see the rise of independent countries. Brazil is one that Marshall brought out. But they see this diminished U.S. influence in the world vis-a-vis some of these rising powers, but they see that as a generally positive thing. What's your reaction to that? Is the diminished leadership role of the United States in the world a net positive, a net negative, or it doesn't make much of a difference?
I think it's a net inevitable. I mean, if you look at globalization and the way economics is moving, you can't anticipate that 1.3 billion Chinese are going to live at the level they lived 30 years ago, and then you start to see 10% growth every year. So, like it or not, you can sit here and talk about American exceptionalism, which I thought was quite surprising. 70% of Americans still subscribe to that. But you're going to have to accept decades ahead when the BRICS and others compete economically and also are going to look at that economic performance and say, I want a bigger slice of the pie. You just have to look at the UN Security Council, 5 nations that represent World War II powers, to say that paradigm can't live forever. So like it or not, it's going to change. The only other thing I'd say, to echo what General Hayden said, is sitting at the threat table, both the CIA and the FBI, I'm surprised how much Americans think about past wars. Historians always say the past doesn't dictate the future. I saw threats with 10 nieces and nephews in cartels, in gangs, Latin American gangs that came out of Californian prisons and are now on the East Coast. We've got more than 10,000 people dying in this country every year from prescription medical fraud, et cetera. We don't seem to worry about this. I live in Old Town Alexandria. There's parts of that town I can't walk into. But people say, you know, terrorism, I'm concerned about, I'm a little worried about Egypt. I don't quite, the future always seems uncertain, but I think it'll turn out okay.
Good. Jim Zogby, one of the important points from Marshall's data was that this idea that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan worsened American relations with the Muslim world. Now this, in spite of the fact that we have, for the first time in history, a president with a partial Muslim heritage and one who really made a top priority of reaching out to the Muslim and Arab worlds in his early years in office. So I'm curious about your reaction to that finding, and in particular, just to broaden it a bit, there seems to be this kind of idea in the Middle East that people respect strength and not weakness. And so, you know, what have we seen in these 4 years in terms of the effect of U.S. policies and U.S. leadership on this point?
Let's start with the last point.
Okay.
It's a favorite of mine because it actually comes from the old colonial mindset of if you're firm and tough and look them straight in the eye and they'll cower and
Right.
bend over and say Sahib. And Brits tried it and didn't work. We tried it and it's not working, and yet it's still being taught. Bernard Lewis is still viewed as an expert in some strange way as the guy who taught us how Arabs think. On the other point, the public is war weary and wary about new wars, precisely because of how badly handled the Iraq War was, in particular. Afghanistan did not create a real dent in terms of Arab opinion. And I think that for the most part, as we saw from the data, the public largely dismissed it and or just tolerated it until the corner was turned and we went up to 100,000 troops, and now there's a real focus on that one. But in terms of both American public opinion of the war and Arab opinion of America, the Iraq War has done a real disservice to the country, to our image, and I think to the public's awareness and sense of how we ought to conduct ourselves in the region. Look, when President Obama was elected, even when it looked like he was going to be elected, polling numbers across the Arab world shot up. By the time he was in office, and we did a 100-day survey, in some countries our favorables had doubled. We released a poll last summer, a little over a year ago now, and our numbers were lower than they were in the last year of the Bush administration. Every single issue the president said he would change, except for getting out of Iraq, which is not viewed as a success anyway, because Iran is now viewed as the dominant power in that country, and a meddlesome power at that. But every single thing the president promised didn't happen. Now, they're not in the Middle East getting into the, well, Republicans stopped them from closing Guantanamo, and there was no accountability on torture, and the Iraq War didn't quite go the way it was because whatever Bush set the stage. Arabs looked at, you promised, it didn't happen, and here's where we are right now. In fact, one of the most disturbing numbers we got was 85% in many countries saying it doesn't matter who the U.S. president is, nothing gets better or changes.
So was it a mistake to raise those expectations, do you think?
I think the president raised expectations on several levels, both domestically and foreign policy, and I think he intended to do them all. But I think what we come down to is the fact that you said we're not going to get into partisan politics, but he had a crew of people saying we're not going to let him win any victories at all, and on the economy, on health care, but also on foreign policy. I mean, look, blocking the closure of Guantanamo, I believe for no good reason, and the Senate legislation cowering Democrats and Republican obstructionism together combined to make that happen. On the Arab-Israeli conflict, I mean, I was in the Middle East. I was at the president's speech when he spoke at the State Department on the 2-year anniversary. I went from there to the Middle East. By the time I got to the Middle East, the prime minister of a foreign government went to our White House and wagged his finger in the face of the president, and then gets invited to speak to a joint session of Congress where he gets 29 standing ovations, more than the president himself could get, and the Arabs were bewildered. It was like, what is this about? That's where the no U.S. president can make a difference. It's just not going to work. And so, yeah, I think he set expectations that he believed in his heart he could accomplish, but the deck was stacked against them because of politics at home.
General Hayden, Jim Zogby raised the issue of Guantanamo. Let's take about 30 seconds to deal with that, okay? You can't say you don't have experience dealing with it. But from this standpoint, I mean, if you look at this sort of as a metaphor or as a symbol, strictly from the standpoint of counterterrorism, what is your thinking these days about whether, you know, putting these guys at Guantanamo made the United States, made sense from a counterterrorism perspective versus this idea that it served as a recruiting tool for al-Qaeda? I mean, that's the key issue, isn't it?
Well, it's one of the issues.
Yeah.
You know, we have a right to defend ourselves too.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had 2 presidents, the Congress and the court system, you know, very powerful consistency. We are a nation at war. And we can use both authorities according to the laws of armed conflict and our own law enforcement authorities to defend ourselves. One of the attributes of making war is to take prisoners. Prisoners need to be kept somewhere. The dilemma we've gotten to now is that we've made it so legally difficult and politically dangerous to capture anyone that we don't capture anyone. We kill, which I don't think is a higher moral plane. Mm-hmm. I'm not objecting to it operationally. It takes the terrorists off the battlefield. But it's not morally superior, and it sure doesn't get you much tactical intelligence from the detainee. And so I probably have a higher comfort level with the fact of Guantanamo as opposed to the brand of Guantanamo, which is something quite different and was quite harmful to us, allowing people to use that as a recruiting tool.
But you say that was harmful to us. The broader question, it seems to me, is how important is the global perception of the United States in terms of U.S. security? I mean, are we sort of more insecure when we are not seen in positive terms, or?
Sure. I mean, I'll be very brief, but in military terms, you have something called the close fight, and you have the deep fight. The close fight, we've been wonderful at, and it's why all those numbers are down in the polling in terms of people feeling danger, because we've essentially prevented people who are already convinced to come and kill or do us harm from doing that. What we've not dealt with very successfully is the deep fight, which is the production rate of those people who might want to kill or do us harm in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. That's been very, very difficult for us to do. And this president, like his predecessor, has been forced to make trade-offs for success in the close fight that may or may not assist you in the deep fight. I'll bring up a point about the president and his promises and so on, and I leave all the politics aside. When you get into that position, I think you find that the left and right-hand boundaries of the lanes you can drive in are much smaller than you anticipated.
Just a quick comment, you know, in the midst of the wet noodle lashing you're giving us here over Gitmo. If you look around, you know,
I won't mention it again, I promise.
In the midst of this debate, if you're in South Korea or Japan, you're going to turn to China for security, or Australia. If you move further west in Western Europe, you're going to turn to Russia. I was living most of the past couple years in the Arabian Gulf, in Saudi Arabia. If you're going to talk about Iran, you're going to turn to China. If you go to Latin America, you're going to turn to Chavez. So we can have these debates about tactical changes in global perceptions. But still, at the macro level, if you're looking around the world at people who say, boy, if push comes to shove, let's see, Putin, not so much. China, I don't think so. Chavez, a little nutty, and he's going to die anyway.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, some of this is a micro conversation.
But the issue, the question that was asked was our standing in the region, and does it impact one way or another? And it does. And the reason why is because the leaders of that region, rightly so, turn to the United States. but the distance that grows between the leadership in the region and their people over the relationship. I was asked actually at the time Mubarak was being threatened by demonstrations, it was an NPR reporter who called and said, would our standing go up if we dumped Mubarak?
Yeah.
And I said, you got the question backwards. We're not unpopular in Egypt because we supported Mubarak. He's unpopular in Egypt because he supported us. In Gaza, with the Iraq war, with rendition, et cetera, and his people knew it. And that is the issue, I think, that our friends and allies are threatened on the governmental level by the relationship with us, and it creates the opening for extremists and for Iran to sort of play off that resentment.
Yeah, although I'd argue that Garib had a lot more to do that than Gitmo.
Yeah, this is tiered, and okay.
I agree with that.
We're not gonna talk about Whitney.
Abu Ghraib is the one
Yeah.
that really
Okay.
branded behavior, and we all agree that was incorrect, even though we argue about one or another aspect of Guantanamo. Tom, can I just offer maybe a slightly different view? I'm talking about the deep fight. Okay, for 10 or 11 years, the deep fight, unfortunately, was about one of the world's great monotheisms and what it meant, and we have no legitimacy whatsoever in talking about that. Now, I know we're multicultural and so on, but broadly we're Judeo-Christian, we're European and African in our heritage, right? We did the same thing in the Cold War. Deep fight, close fight, hold it, fold deep fight, ideological battle with communism. But communism is a Western philosophy, written by a German in London. So we've got legitimacy talking about that. We have almost no legitimacy talking about the meaning of the Quran or the Hadith. The good news, Jim, and I think you've suggested this in the last couple of years, is that the deep fight, such as it exists, has changed. It's not about the caliphate. It's about responsible governments, rule of law, voting procedures, and so on. We actually know something about that, and we actually have some legitimacy talking about that. And so I'm somewhat hopeful that all the turbulence it means for the kind of work Phil and I used to do in terms of counterterrorism, for the deep look towards the horizon, opportunity.
Yeah. Let's move a little bit away from the abstract and talk about real people in real places. And we've all mentioned Egypt, and I think it's a fascinating case study. We now have a president of Egypt who comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. He would, from all outward appearances, seem to be less willing to play that kind of strategic partnership role in counterterrorism than Mubarak did. So I'm curious about your feelings about whether the leadership of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt, how it's playing out in terms of what does it mean for U.S. National security interests in that region. Let's begin with you, Phil.
There's not much humor in counterterrorism, but when I saw the Arab uprisings, I don't believe in the Arab Spring, by the way. I think there's going to be a lot of bumps. But when I saw the Arab uprisings and watched Al Qaeda try to formulate a response, you have to sit back there as a counterterrorism specialist and take it where you can get it. I'm sitting there saying they have no idea what to say. And so, to pick up on General Hayden's point, we've got a dog in the fight operationally in counterterrorism, that is taking out leadership, for example, and helping others. We don't have much of a dog in this fight ideologically because we have no traction in that universe. Now we've got somebody between us and the adversary who's viewed by the adversary, that is Al-Qaeda and its sympathizers, what I would call Al-Qaedism, as potentially as much of an enemy as we are.
You're talking about Morsi.
That's correct. So people don't know in this country, the Salafis hate the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're in writing saying this for years. So I think when you're looking at the potential of this crescent in Tunisia and Libya and Egypt of Islamist rise, we ought to be sitting back saying, first, they got the vote, and I'm a Democrat. That means if they win, we support them. And second, even if I didn't like it, they're going to be the best ideological foil we got.
Do you agree with that, Jim?
I want to just shift gears a bit and look at the public opinion here in the United States vis-a-vis Egypt, which I think is fascinating, because in all the years we'd poll on how do you feel about Egypt, favorable, unfavorable, or the leadership of Egypt, we'd get a 2/3 favorable, 1/3 unfavorable, and even higher. There were some years during the Clinton administration where Egypt's numbers were higher than Israel's. Since Arab Spring, or since the upheaval in Egypt, those numbers have changed. Democrat numbers have not changed at all. The same, 2-to-1 favorable. Republican numbers are the opposite, 2-to-1 unfavorable. on the election, the point you made about Morsi and winning, and we believe in democracy, therefore, that's a view shared by Democrats, not by Republicans. And so what we have now is that for the first time, the Egyptian numbers, favorable, unfavorable, overall are dead even. But what to do about Egypt, as you say in the survey, cutting aid becomes the option. Distancing ourselves in some ways becomes the option. But again, that is a view held by Republicans, but not by Democrats. And the factors are generational and race. There is a racial and generational partisan divide. African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and what we call first globals, you call millennials, the 18 to 29 group, much more open to Arab countries, to Islam, to a more tolerant view of the world, and older, middle-aged white guys, very different attitudes. And it's troubling because it's one thing when it's an ideological debate, but when it becomes locked into demographic groups that sort of like, almost like Harry Potter, put the sorting hat on and go into their respective parties, then it becomes, I think, a much more difficult issue to address.
Speaking of older, middle-aged white guys, I was wondering how this could be maybe a representative.
He's talking about Harry Potter. He's got kids, obviously.
Looking at the diversity in the panel, but anyway, go ahead.
All the women who were up there.
Actually, that's the other group in the demographic group. It's educated professional women. They're in that liberal cohort.
Well, General Hayden, what about the near fight versus long fight implications of what's happening in Egypt and across the Middle East?
Yeah, great danger for the near fight. You've got an intelligence service with whom we cooperated, all right, with a counterterrorism partner, not a bad one, that is at best disinterested in this, all right, and distracted. But in return for that, you've got political developments. Phil's hit it right on. I mean, this is in the heartland of Al-Qaeda, and they had absolutely nothing to do with it and had a great deal of difficulty knowing what to even say about it. Mm-hmm. And so, as dangerous as it is for us, as disturbing as it might be, it opens the door to something that was closed to us for the first 10 years of the conflict.
Mm-hmm. But look at we have Syria, for example, right now. In Egypt, Mohammed Morsi is playing a very aggressive role in the I shouldn't say a leadership role in the Arab world and trying to rally Arab support for the anti-government forces in Syria. Is it dangerous for the United States to sort of sit back and let these kind of regional dynamics play out, let the Arab League take the lead here? Or, with U.S. interests so clearly at stake in the outcome of that conflict, does the United States really need to be in a greater leadership position than it is?
I dispute your premise, okay. and I sort of, to make the panel more amusing, dispute something that you said earlier, Jim, and that is, I'm not sure Americans don't like Iraq and Afghanistan because they're mishandled. I think they decided, well, we got a lot more significant interest. They forgot, halfway about 9/11. If we had 8 attacks, people would have said, intervention in Afghanistan, it's a great thing. How about Pakistan? Mm-hmm. So I think some of what's happening is people are saying, these aren't national security threats. We said India and Pakistan are having a nuke, national security threat. Most Americans probably don't know they have nukes today. Mm-hmm. We say Syria, national security threat. I think not so much. So I think the lesson we're taking away is that Americans, smarter often than Washingtonians give them credit for. I guess we're Americans too. Let me take that back. Not inside the Beltway. But Americans have said, look, war is the last resort when diplomacy fails. All the numbers on diplomacy are interesting. And diplomacy didn't quite fail in Iraq. We used U.S. forces. We lost 3,000 plus boys. That doesn't make sense to me. And so they're deciding not where we succeeded and failed. They're deciding what national security interests are, and they're saying it's not until it's an existential threat.
Mm-hmm. Well,
you asked about Syria?
Yeah.
It is a mess, and there's no good outcome. Right. And I think that the president is right to be cautious. This is a situation where we say the right thing about Assad's got to go, but we also are very cautious about what comes next and what role we can legitimately play, whether or not, I said during the time of the Mubarak thing that there was nobody in Tahrir Square waiting for America to sprinkle holy water on the revolution. clearly there is not, I mean, there are those in Egypt, in Syria today who are saying, give us this, give us this, we'll be your friends for life. But I heard that in Afghanistan back in the 70s, and I heard it from Shalaby in Iraq. And where are they today?
Yeah.
So I think we have to be very careful about, looking at Syria, seeing the role we might play in Syria, but then thinking about what the end game in Syria is. I think that I had hoped that Annan could succeed. I surely hope right now that Lakhdar Brahimi can succeed. I think that the better game is pressure on the Russians and the Chinese to come up with some way of helping to push Assad, and then us working with the Saudis and the allies they have on the ground to come up with some transitional formula. But even then, I don't think we're going to see a dying down of this sort of metastasized conflict that is now spread down to villages and tribes and families. It's going to be a long time before the Syrians settle down.
Well, I would think that the one vital interest that the U.S. has in Syria is the implications of the outcome there for Iran and what it means about Iran's position. You're even frowning at that.
Well, yeah, I think that's a net plus for us. You've got, separation between, I think, Hezbollah and Iran. We have a very difficult time in this country. We're not very good historians, but we do remember hostages, and we remember embassies being bombed. Hezbollah has become not only a political force in Lebanon, it's become far more than a terrorist group. Mm-hmm. And I think they have fundamentally different interests than Iran does right now, even in the event of a strike on Iran's nuclear facility.
Different from Iran's.
Different than Iran's. And I think the loss of that sort of intermediary, that is Syria, which was the overland route for Iran to supply Lebanon, is a net plus. The Iranians were starting to look, as Hezbollah started to rise, as Bashar al-Assad was there, as Iran was moving in to support some of the Shia in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. If you look at it geographically, that Iranian crescent, talking to my friends in the Gulf, they're saying this ain't so good. Mm-hmm. And now with what Hezbollah is doing, which is, I'd argue, a more sort of conservative force, and with what's happening in Syria, I'd say Iran is on a bit of a back foot.
Well, you're just arguing that we do have a vital interest in the weakening of the Assad regime then.
That's different than saying we should intervene.
Okay, all right.
And it is being weakened, and it is being delegitimized. And probably nothing is doing more right now to delegitimize Iran in the region than what is happening in Syria and their role in Syria. The best guarantee we'd have that we could reverse that is if we got involved. Because there's only one country more unpopular in the Middle East than Iran, us. I'd say, and add Israel to the mix too.
Right.
But,
Thank you.
but hey, that's in another league.
And the Israelis are incredibly studied at leaving hands off.
Uh-huh.
Because I think they realize this as well. And to reinforce Phil's point about Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah, there is daylight between them and the Iranians already. They are stressed by this. I'm a little unhappy that Nasrallah has tacked as much as he has to support Assad. But my metaphor is Hezbollah is a little bit like the Corleone family in Godfather 3. Right? They want out. They're more than just a terrorist organization, and they're a political party there in Lebanon, and they want to build on that leg as opposed to the terrorism leg, and this is forcing them back.
Okay, before we go into the audience questions, we do have to wrap up with Iran. It seems to me, Marshall, that from your data, you can almost come to any conclusion you want about Iran. On the one hand, the Americans are much less inclined to support military intervention. On the other hand, it was very clear from your data that Iran is the one threat that they really do take seriously. So you can, if you're a president, if you're an administration, you can sort of make use of those findings to support almost any policy you want. Diplomacy, threat of military action, et cetera. I'm not even sure what question to ask here, but let's begin with you, gentlemen. What would you be advising about Iran in terms of how important is U.S. leadership, the dangers of unilateral action, the dangers of sort of dithering and waiting for the UN to get behind you? How do you sort that all out?
I try to sort it out as director of CIA for President Bush for the 3 years I was in office with him, and we didn't. This is a problem from hell. All the options are bad. Mm-hmm. Right? Iran getting a weapon, or Iran getting so close to getting a weapon that it's almost the same thing, has long-term ill effects for the entire region. Is destabilizing. Our taking action mm-hmm. to move against the Iranian nuclear program has transient effects and almost certainly guarantees that which we're trying to prevent. An Iran that will stop at nothing to get a weapon. And so there are no good answers to this.
Bill Mudd?
I think Americans tend to think we're driving down, this is to pick up something you said, an 8-lane highway here with options. And actually it's about a 1-lane, village road, because the capability to destroy the infrastructure, and I'm not just talking about physical destruction, I'm talking about the incredible engineering and scientific expertise that Iran has. We don't have that capability. I don't think we do, with a buried, dispersed, and hidden program. And second, it's a rare place where sanctions work. Sanctions are having a tremendous impact on Iran. So I look at this and say, you can say whatever you want on the stump, but in terms of your options, forget about thinking that you've got options from bombing the heck out of them to doing nothing. Your options are very limited, and we saw how those options played out in North Korea, Pakistan, India. I think this is inevitable, and we just can't say it.
Sanctions are having a tremendous impact on the Iranian economy. There's not much evidence that they're having much of an impact on Iranian decision-making.
I think that's true. I'm not sure we understand Iran that well, but again, it's not like we have a lot of options. We can pretend like we do, we just don't.
Mm-hmm. What's at stake, Jim?
There used to be a time when we were popular in Iran, and we're not. And I think that we have played into the supreme leader and Ahmadinejad's game for way too long now. He wants to be the baddest boy on the block. He wants to be the guy who, when he gets up and says outrageous stuff, we go, oh my God, he's outrageous, we've got to do something. And the more, I call it the Farrakhan factor. It's like, Farrakhan knew that when Jesse Jackson was rising, that all he had to do was say something absolutely disgraceful and outrageous, and he would force sort of establishment leadership in Washington to denounce him, whereupon he would then come to town without a single bit of advertising and draw 25,000 people to an arena because he was the guy who was sort of preying off the alienation and the anger. Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader, both as different as they are, play the same game. The point is that I think, as much as this will never happen, that ridicule would be a better tool to confront him with than threats. In other words, okay, little man, want a bomb? What are you going to do with it? Sit on it? Feed your people with it? No, we're giving him bragging rights, which is what he wants. And in fact, like Pakistan, the bomb for them was not really a defense issue. Well, there's no first use, there's no second use it, and 5 seconds later you're dead. I mean, the point is that the only thing you can get out of it is to say there, I got one, and I'm bigger than you now. Don't give him that. Let him play the game and ridicule the effort. It would be better to diminish them than to make them our equal in the eyes of the arena in which he's playing.